G'day Poetry Geeks, I'm Jackson and you are watching The Poetry Show, and in today's Poetry Show we are going to be answering the question of how you will know when your poem is finished. Okay, I'm being a bit cheeky today because these 10 rules or these 10 tests you can use for figuring out when a poem is finished don't actually come from me. They're from Simon Armitage, and he wrote this really excellent piece in The Guardian years ago. The Guardian ran this excellent series, 7 or 8 years ago. And it was all about how to write poetry, and some of it's still available online, some of it's been taken down, but Simon Armitage's one is one that actually stuck with me all these years, and it's still available online, so I'll link to it in the description below this video. If you don't know who Simon Armitage is, I only have one collection of Simon Armitage. It's not even a collection, it's just one poem. But if you don't know who Simon Armitage is, you need to go and find that out first so that you know that his word on what makes a good poem can be taken seriously. So anyway, like I said, this oh, by the way, this collection, or this poem, Killing Time, was something that Simon Armitage wrote for the turn of the millennium back in 2000. And it's a 1,000 line poem looking at the last 1,000 years of human history. And it's phenomenal. It's really splendid. And it cost me £7 and it was perfect. So read that, read everything Simon Armitage has ever done because he's a superstar poet. Anyway, so what does Simon Armitage suggest are the 10 ways you can tell when a poem is finished? Well, he comes up with these 10 tests, and he himself in the article says it's not about these being hard and fast rules that always have to be stuck to, and he makes some comment about you don't have to do this under laboratory conditions, but they are a good checklist for you to consider when you've written a poem and you're looking at it. If you don't have anybody to provide some critical feedback on it for you, these are some critical questions you can ask yourself. So anyway, what are the 10 tests? The first test is the eye test. So Simon Armitage suggests that we look at our poem printed on the page, and does it look pleasing to the eye? Does it look as though some thought has gone into the shape of it? Now, because I'm a teacher, I often have to read quite a lot of student poetry, and one of the things I find happens with some student poetry when they're beginning is the line lengths can be completely arbitrary. And that's kind of okay when you're starting out. You might not necessarily have much of a philosophy, if you like, behind how you do your line breaks. But something that often stands out to me is you might have a lot of, lines that are all about this length, and then there's one that just shoots off because, the student wanted to try and finish an idea and didn't feel like a line break should come in there. And as a reader of poetry, what immediately jumps out to me is this question of why is that one line so much longer than the others? Was that something the poet was trying to do, or was it an accident? And most of the time it's an accident. So this eye test is a great one where you can just look at how it's laid out on the page, and just as a poet you can decide, does the look of that on the page convey the kind of meaning that I'm intending to convey? The second test that Simon Armitage talks about is the magic eye test. So you don't just look at it on the page, but you also stare at it for long enough, and when he says this, he actually means read it again and again and again. But like a magic eye picture, the longer you look at it, does it reveal something else to you? And there have been poems I've read over the years that have unlocked their secrets for me, maybe many years later. I think particularly of the poem I talked about the other day, The Colossus by Sylvia Plath. The first few times I read that, I could very easily see it from a perspective of authority and patriarchy, but I was actually quite blind to the affection in the poem. And as I was reading it the other day before I made that video, that affection that comes through in the poem really kind of spoke to me afresh. And I think that's one of those kind of magic eye qualities that a poem doesn't have to give all of its secrets away immediately, and that's one of the beautiful things about poetry. They can live with you and they can kind of talk to you long after you've first encountered them. Another test that he suggests is the hearing test. Now, because poetry was initially designed as a spoken oral form of storytelling, The oral quality, the way it sounds to the human ear, is an important thing to consider. It's not the be-all and end-all, but one of the questions you might want to ask yourself is, has the way that you've constructed certain phrases and lines, the way you've juxtaposed certain words, is that pleasing to the ear? And if it's not pleasing to the ear, if it's particularly discordant, if you've provided some sort of cacophony rather than euphony, is that for an effect? Is that a good thing that you've done, but even if it sounds, bad? So that hearing test is an important one. The fourth test that Armitage suggests is one that he calls the pH test, and in that he basically means pH as the poetic handicraft test. Now, when he refers to poetic handicraft, he's talking pretty much about all of those different poetic techniques that you may have heard of, poetic techniques that you may not have heard of, but that I will be exploring one by one through this series. And he's making the point that you don't necessarily have to use all of these different poetic techniques, but if you have you used them in a way that adds to the quality of the poem, or does it kind of make itself a little bit too obvious and a little bit too, he uses the phrase, does it poke out at the edges? Does it jut out? Does it create a rough edge to the poem, or is it something that kind of fits in really seamlessly with what you've tried to achieve? And I think sometimes one of the mistakes that amateur poets make is an over-reliance on too many poetic techniques, and it just feels clunky. You can kind of see where they've tried to use a technique, and it draws too much attention to itself rather than kind of developing the feeling and the meaning of the poem. The fifth test that Armitage talks about is what he calls the IQ test, and he says this is a double test and it's got nothing to do with intelligence. He says it's one to do with the imaginative quality of your poem. So does it embody some sort of dream life itself? Does it awaken your imagination as you read the poem? And the second part of this test, he says, is the inherent quotability of your poem. Are there words, lines, or phrases in your poem that will stick with the reader in their mind long after the book is closed and the page is gone? And I'll give you a perfect example of this. I was watching a new BookTube channel that I've just come across recently by Jen Campbell, and I'll put a link to her in the video somewhere. And she was reading this poem from a collection called Little Armour, and I can't remember the name of the poet, so I'm going to have to go and look that up. And it's a poem called Wasp. And the poem itself is quite simple. It's just a list, if you like, of various similes and metaphors to describe a wasp. But there was this beautiful line in it where the wasp is described as a little clinging cashew nut. And that immediately has that inherent quotability that Armitage is talking about to me. As soon as I heard Jen Campbell read these words, little clinging cashew nut, I knew that idea was going to be in my head for at least the next year. So that's the kind of thing Armitage is talking about. The sixth test that Armitage talks about is the test of time. And you can look at this a couple of ways. Do you think your poem will does it have a very short shelf life? Sometimes overly kind of poppy or overly political poems can have a quite short shelf life, because obviously the thing they're referring to, it's maybe something that's only of immediate concern, but it's going to go away. So there's nothing wrong with writing poems that respond to things that happen immediately, but you might want to ask yourself the question, is this poem going to have some staying power? If somebody comes to read this again in a week, will it still matter to them? If they read it again in a year, will it matter to them? If they read it 30 seconds from now, will it still matter to them? So the idea is you want to have something in your poetry that will stay with people and will want people to stay with that poem. Another test that Simon Armitage mentions is the test of nerves, which is his seventh test, and he suggests that poetry should not just be merely descriptive, and it shouldn't just tell you something, it should make you feel something. There should be this sensory experience within poetry. So that's what he refers to as the test of nerves. Are you just telling people what they should think, or are you helping them feel that thing so they can determine what they should think based on their feeling? And that's something that we often tell young writers when they're writing in prose, for example, that they should show, not tell. And I think sometimes in poetry you go one further. You don't just want to tell them, you don't just want to show them, you also want to help them feel. You want to provide them with that experience firsthand, which is one of the wonderful things about poetry, I think. The next test that Simon Armitage mentions, test number 8, is the lie detector test. And he says not every poem has to tell the truth, the 100% truth, but every poem should be true to itself. There should be something internally consistent within the poem at least. Although I happen to believe that poems should be true to human nature and the human experience. So I kind of disagree with him slightly about whether a poem has to tell the truth. Or do I? I guess something like My Last Duchess, where, you know, the guy's basically killed his wife, but you don't. Yeah, maybe Simon Armitage is right. Hey, who knew? The 9th test, if I can keep count, is the spelling test, and that is not a check of your spelling, punctuation and grammar, but rather it is the test of whether your poem is able to cast a spell over the reader. Can you transport them to somewhere else with the text that you have in front of you? Now for me, that is a little bit more of a spurious test, because obviously I think the words I'm writing are going to cast a spell over the reader. The reader might disagree, and that's their prerogative. But nonetheless, that is Simon Armitage's 9th rule or test. And the 10th and final test that Simon Armitage mentions is the acid test. And this is the one where you boil down the poem for all it is worth to try and find that secret ingredient. Does it have that thing in it that makes it a successful poem? And that is something that you will be asking yourself again and again and again. But he makes an excellent point at the end of this article where he says, is it possible for you to write a truly great poem if you've never read one? And that was a point I made in my first video in this series. If you want to be an excellent poet, you need to read excellent poets. And by the process of osmosis, immersing yourself in the words of much, much wiser people than yourself, you will come to understand what a truly great poem is, and you'll know when you can recognize it. And the only way you can do that is by reading lots of poetry. So I recommend reading lots of Simon Armitage as a jumping off point. Read lots of everybody else you've ever heard of, and read lots of people that you've never heard of. And you will one day be able to perform that acid test for yourself and determine whether your poem that you have just written is worthy to be called finished. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. I'm sorry if it was a bit waffly. I was very tired today. I didn't want to make it. I rattled through it. I'm hungry. Excuses, excuses, I know. But if you've liked this video and you'd like to see more, then please subscribe. If you would like me to talk about any poems in particular and perform some sort of mini analysis on them, or just give you my thoughts about them, please leave me a comment or send me a message separately, and I will be more than happy to provide my thoughts and my ramblings and my ideas about any of the poems that you happen to love. And hey, I don't even care if you're doing it for school homework. I will willingly talk about any poem for any reason for free. So there you go. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.